Hello, writers and crafters. I'm Valerie Isan.
And I'm Eric Mertz.
And this is episode 53 of the podcast, and it's February 1st, 2022, as we record this. Today, we have exciting news. We have a guest speaker with us. We're going to talk about dialogue with the dialogue doctor himself, Jeff Elkins.
Hi, everybody. Super excited to be here. Thanks for letting me come on. I'm pumped.
Jeff Elkins writes stories about outsiders who fight for outcasts, rejects, and the oppressed. He is the author of more than 10 novels, a certified 3-story method editor, and the host of the Dialogue Doctor podcast. During the day, he leads the writing team for a training company that simulates difficult conversations. He lives in north of Baltimore, Maryland, with his wife of 20 years and his 5 kids. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Thanks for having me. It's super great to be here. That intro feels very intimidating. There's a lot of words in that. I need to cut that down. But I appreciate you having me here.
Like, you're the first doctor I think I've ever been on a podcast with. So.
Yeah, I'm not actually a doctor. I just play one on podcasts.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's comforting.
Yeah, intimidating to me is like, man, that poor dude has a lot going on. He needs to slow that crap down. Like that's what I think when you read that. But yeah, thanks for having me. It's fun to be here.
I've got a couple more announcements and then we'll get into some more chit chat. The registration is currently open for the Writer Craft Writing Retreat and Workshop for August 11th through the 14th. The registration will close actually April 2nd, 2022, so that I can secure the venue and the lodging and the food and RSVP and all that stuff. So a couple more months. Tickets for 3 days, 3 nights, all lodging, all meals, 3 speakers, lots of retreat time, coaching, yoga, reflexology, community, totally social distanced. It's outside, folks. There will be masks. It's outside. It's great. $840, and there is a monthly payment plan. This podcast is sponsored by our patrons at patreon.com/Valerie Isan. For as low as $1 a month, you can get a shout out on the podcast, and we can make announcements for you on the podcast. And at other tiers, the benefits increase. Free books, accountability Zoom calls, scene analysis, mastermind calls, and even free Writer Craft retreat tickets. Become a patron of the arts at patreon.com/Valerie Isan. I think I need to shorten that somehow. I don't know. How do I get all that in?
No, it sounds like you got a lot of amazing stuff going on. Don't shorten it at all. It's great.
So we like to start out with what we're reading. Jeff, what are you reading?
I am currently, I'm reading The Witch's Revenge.
Ooh.
I actually have my books right here so I can hold them up for the YouTubers. I'm reading The Witch's Revenge by S.W. Miller.
Okay.
Sean this is his first book, brand new indie author. And it's really great, really solid dialogue, really compelling characters. He does a good job. I like it because it's your standard urban fantasy of like witches in a modern world. He's British. It takes place in England. What's nice about it is that his scenes, even the action scenes, are very dialogue centric. That's really hard to do. So
yeah,
it's a really good one. It reads super fast. It's very engaging. And then I also just started this one. I'm on the first chapter of Network Effect.
Yeah, I've seen that around.
I'm loving it so far. But yeah, so those are the 2 things I'm reading right now.
What about you, Eric?
I'm reading a book called One Last Lie. It's by Paul Doran, who's a Maine mystery author. And I think I've talked about him before. I really like the main character is a game warden. And it's just for me, it's just an interesting way to get into a crime is through a game warden's perspective versus, your standard cop or PI. And this one is kind of especially, I guess it deals with, especially kind of dark, and it kind of deals with some wild wolves that had been slaughtered and the investigation into that. And so I've read probably half of the series. They read them out of order, which is, I guess, fine because I've loved every one of them. But just started that last night.
Cool. I am reading Nobody's Magic. It's actually not out yet, I don't think. Perks of being a bookstore seller, or working in a bookstore.
Advanced copies.
Yeah, advanced copy. It's about I don't actually know where in the US she is, but she said that Detroit was north of her. So probably in that region of the US. And she's an albino Black woman, 20 years old, and her parents have really kept her sheltered. And she's just now trying to like get a driver's license, you know, and start like having friends. And because there were some unfortunate events of really horrific bullying that happened, you know, as a child. And so it's really interesting. And it's written in dialect, Jeff. You'll have to talk about that a little bit
Ooh,
later.
Interesting.
It's
That's
not
a,
as bad as, or not bad, sorry. When I first read These Eyes Were Watching God,
yeah.
that I had to read out loud for the first
Mhm.
2 chapters before I could get the cadence.
Yeah.
And then I could read it to myself. And this one I didn't have to do it all. I can immediately hear
That's
her
cool.
voice. So it is in dialect, but it's not heavy. Like everything is spelled American English. It's just in words that maybe I wouldn't have grammatically put together. Does that
Nice.
make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So that's still
Yeah.
dialect. It's just
Both of those books sound amazing. I'm always up for a detective novel where the detective isn't a cop, is like some kind of like, you know, different off branch. And yeah, dialogue is gutsy. Dialect is gutsy. If you pull it off, it can be a big win, but it's dangerous.
right. I
If
would
not-
never write in dialect.
It's dangerous.
Also,
Take a big risk.
I think especially if you don't speak in that dialect, like you're the author, I think that you run into that. Are you making fun of this dialect? You know, are you really
Yeah.
representing this in a stereotypical way? Or, you know,
Even if you're doing fantasy, like I've read some fantasy pieces that are like, you know, you've like developed this like elfish language, but man, it really feels like they're from Ireland, and it really feels like you're like mocking the Irish a little bit with your elfish here. Like, you know, the curtain isn't as closed as you want it to be, to like revealing what's actually going on behind the scenes. So yeah, it's risky.
Yeah.
Again, if you can pull it off, you know, if you're I can't,
an
Horston?
Irish elf.
Yeah, no, I was thinking, who wrote Their Eyes Are Watching God? Was that Horston? I'm trying to remember.
Zora
Person,
Neale
yeah,
Hurston?
Zora Neale
Yeah.
Hurston.
You know, if you're her, go all in, but
Right.
tread to fear and trembling as you approach that dialogue.
All right. So, Jeff, I don't like to ask the same questions that everybody else that's ever interviewed you asks, but I really do think that your origin story is super interesting. Can you just sort of like three minutes or less?
That's a fascinating question. My origin story. Which origin story would you like? Because I think, like, you know, like all people, like all stories, like all people, you know, we can shape our story to be to match the narrative that we have in our mind and our perspective. And I think we can all kind of do that with our orange story. So I could tell you like the, you know, ex-pastor outcast origin story that would like be one way, like, you know, a girl grew up in the church, when became a pastor, I fell out of love with organized
Being a
religion,
pastor.
desperately needed a job, got hired as a writer, you know, and then started writing novels because I didn't want my children to starve. Like, I can give you that one. Or there's the, like, you know, dialogue doctor origin story, which was I was working.
That was the one I was talking about. Yes.
Okay, I was working as
but the other one was really interesting too.
Yeah, the other was my novelist origin story. The dialogue doctor origin story is I was working, I had a massive career shift, which I actually just described in the previous origin story. and I had been writing just kind of on the side for therapeutic reasons for like a year. I didn't grow up wanting to be a writer. I was dyslexic when I am dyslexic. It's not something that you get cured from. I'm dyslexic, so I always hated English classes. The only class I ever failed in college in my life was freshman composition. So it was like English, and I just didn't get along. And I started writing because I found that writing short stories relieved a lot of the stress from my day job. And so somebody had been reading my short stories, and she was a friend. She'd been a friend for like 12 years. I got fired from a gig and was like literally about to be homeless. And she was like, hey, why don't you come and work for my company? We're hiring a whole squadron of writers. And I got in and really took to it. That was about 8 years ago. Um, and, I already had a proclivity for dialogue. Like that was just what I wrote. Because I grew like because my professional life had been all about talking to people. And I love people in general, that like short stories and things that I was writing were very people centric. Uh, but this job accelerated that 1,000-fold because uh, as a writer for that company, we mimic difficult conversations. So my job is to walk into a room of like subject matter experts that might be in the military or might be in law enforcement or might be like counselors that are experts in cognitive behavioral therapy or drug peer advocates that are talking to heroin addicts all the time, like whatever the difficult conversation is. My team walks in and we learn how it happens and how it works and all the ins and outs of it, and then we replicate it for a kind of AI centric simulation. So I've been doing that for 8 years and just kind of like obsessing over the ins and outs of how to reproduce realistic dialogue. And I was talking to Jay Thorne, who is I mean, just Google Jay Thorne. I was talking to Jay Thorne, and he was like, hey, you should take what you're doing in your day job and try to bring it to the writing community. So I really wanted to give back. I've super benefited from podcasts and from people who give their expertise to those of us trying to figure out how to be writers. And this felt like a way that I could kind of like give back to the community. So we started the podcast and it was going really well. And I started it, on the Dialogue Doctor podcast. We do every other episode is an editing session. So we bring writers on and they give me like 2,000 to 4,000 words, and we just edit their dialogue and we work on like, hey, here's, it's a coaching session of like, hey, here's how you can improve what you're writing. When I started off, I wanted to make sure that like I could actually do that. So before we started the podcast, I did about 15 people's work. I was like, hey, I'm just going to edit your stuff for free, pass it on, and we'll edit it. And they really appreciate the edits and said that they were getting better at writing dialogue. So that's kind of what launched the podcast. And we've been going for about a year now. It's a lot of fun. We got a little budding community around it of a bunch of people that are all trying to learn dialogue together, kind of on this dialogue journey together.
Nice.
Yeah, so it's great. I love it. We do editing, and we have a big workshop coming up on February 26th, where we're going to teach you to write a dialogue centric scene, meaning like a dialogue only first draft, a quick and dirty dialogue only first draft, and then taking that draft and bringing back the prose after you've written that first draft. We're going to teach you how to do that. My partner in the Dialogue Doctor is Laura. She also works at the company with me that mimics dialogue, and we're going to teach you how to do that so that ideally you're not adding any time to your writing, so that you can get a dialogue centric first draft and do a second pass and get all your prose in there. And ideally in the same time, it's going to take you to write your first draft originally. So that's the workshop we're doing on February 26th.
Wow. Is it an all-day workshop or?
It's 4 hours. And it's a fun, it's an interesting thing that I do with the community all the time. Like every Tuesday, the community, we center on a Slack group that we have. We
That's
put out
through
a
your
writing
Patreon, right?
Yeah, it costs $1 a month to
Okay.
be in. And if you can't afford $1 a month, if you email me, I'll probably just let you do it for free. But it's I didn't say that out loud. But we do a writing prompt every Tuesday. And the goal of that writing prompt is to write a dialogue only first draft. And working it with people and talking it with people, it's you do about 4 or 5 of them, and then you naturally just start writing dialogue centric scenes. It's really an exercise you only have to do for a little bit, and then it'll radically transform your writing. So that's how we're talking. That's what we're going to teach in the workshop. We're going to be like, hey, let us teach you this exercise. You're going to do it for like a month, and then you won't have to go through this 2-step process again, because when you first draft, this is going to be so natural to you, it's just going to happen. Yeah, so that's but that's the kind of stuff we do over at the Dialogue Doctor. It's working on craft a lot.
So what, and Eric, chime in with questions. I got a couple of questions.
I had a question right away. Jeff, do you ever
Sure.
go to a restaurant and overhear dialogue from people and say like, no, that's not right? Like, you're a lawyer. Lawyers don't talk like that. Do you ever like?
No. I carry a journal with me.
Oh, good.
And wherever I am, if I hear 2 people talking and I find the dialogue fascinating, I wait till I have a second alone, and then I just write it down. It's something I started doing back way before the Dialogue Doctor, when I was kind of like getting into writing short stories. I discovered writing, like I said, I was in a super stressful day job, and it was just crushing my soul. It was I was in change management, so I was trying to help this organization change that didn't really want to change, and it was tough. And so many angry meetings. And so I would say I'd come home at night and I just like write a fictional short story as like a way to process. And I did that like every night for, about 75 days. I was just cranking out a short story a night. And I found myself like listening, changing how I listen to people, and really starting to mimic how people talk in the real world. So like just walking around listening to cadences and how people engage with each other, like when they come into a conversation and when they don't come into a conversation, and and how different personalities impact the way that they use sentence structure, and the way that they insert themselves into ongoing conversations and stuff like that. So I do sit in restaurants and listen to people talk. It's a little creepy. And yeah, it's I think of it as kind of like, when I was a teenager, I had the privilege of going to Amsterdam, and I spent a day in the Van Gogh Museum there, and I was shocked to see that he had all these because when I think of Van Gogh, I think of like non-realistic paintings, right? Like big colors and like more feeling art than like detail art. And so I was there and I was looking around, and they have all of his journals on display, and his journals are these like, hands where he would just like sit in the fountain, the town square, and just like draw 1,000 hands that he saw, or he'd draw like 1,000 noses, or he'd draw like mouths. And it was like, oh, this is how he learned to draw people, as he just sat there and drew people. And so I do recommend for writers, like, yeah, go sit in a coffee house and pull out your laptop like you're working and eavesdrop and listen to how people talk, and listen to how they interact with each other. Because your readers, the thing about dialogue in writing is that your readers' brains are hardwired to feel emotion through verbal communication, right? Like that's how we convey what we're feeling and what we're doing, is through that verbal interaction. So if you can tap into that by making your dialogue feel realistic, you're 2 steps ahead of the game on taking your reader on an emotional journey in your work. Right. So it's yeah, sorry.
Yeah, David Mamet, we had the great response to that grad student who said, what should as a writer, should I go to grad school? And David Mamet said, no, find a bar where there's no TV and sit down and listen to people talk, and just,
that's amazing.
And just hone in, and I think that's the best advice ever, really.
That's amazing. I've never heard that before. And I love that advice so much.
So I have a question. What would you say, since you're editing people's dialogue all the time, what are the maybe top 2 dialogue mistakes that you see frequently?
Top 2 faux pas? So there's one that's super easy to catch. So, and it's one I see all the time. It has to do with the absence of dialogue, actually. So what we do as writers a lot is we write the scenes that are most exciting to us. right? Like, and we invest in those scenes. Often we invest too much in those scenes. And then the in-between stuff, we know we have to take the reader on this journey from like point A that we were really excited about to point B that we're really excited about. We don't know how to get there. So what we do is we end up writing what I call summary paragraphs, which are these paragraphs we're just like bombarding the reader with like events and things that are happening in this person's life, or like the way you'll write like 2 paragraphs about how this person felt about the way that this thing just happened, right? Like, or you'll lay out for me a scene where you're like, and after that, Judy went to the coffee house and she sat at the coffee house for 7 hours and pondered how she felt about Billy. And as she sat there in the coffee house and pondered how she felt about Billy, she had a great conversation with the barista about it. And the barista gave her wonderful advice. And then she took that advice and she went off and she talked to her mom. And it's like, you know, if you find yourself with a paragraph like that, there's 2 questions I tell people to ask. Like, one, is it necessary? And if it's not necessary, then cut it. If it is necessary, if this is something that needs to be explained for the plot, then can I put it into a conversation? Can I make this moment that I have to get across into an actual scene where multiple characters are interacting, as opposed to this like summary paragraph where you're telling me what's happening? Because in essence, dialogue is showing, right? Like we hear all the time that like, show me, don't tell me. Dialogue is showing. So if you can get it into a conversation, your book's going to take these huge leaps from telling to showing.
I hear a lot of writers say to me, like they assume that dialogue is telling and not showing. And I always balk at that. Like it is definitely a way of showing.
Yeah, it's like I talk about it like the way that I like to think of it is like that you're a forest that you're either like in a helicopter looking down on, or that you're in amongst the trees, right? Like those are 2 very different perspectives on the forest. In amongst the trees, smelling the forest, like feeling the air, hearing the ground crunch beneath your feet, you know, being able to like compare the roughness of the bark to the leaves falling around you, like getting the environment, whether that forest is scary or whimsical or like whatever that forest is, right? Like that's super different than being in a helicopter, you know, 1,000 feet above and looking down on this massive forest. In your novel, you need both perspectives. You need moments where you're looking down on the story and you're getting this like grand scope. You don't need as many of them as you think. I promise. You only need like 1 or 2, but you need these moments where you're looking down. But your reader wants to be in the forest. That's why they're there. They're in your book in order to experience what your characters are experiencing. And so it's the interaction between characters that is that showing, right? That is that like in the forest moment. We want to live in that scene. And the easiest way to force yourself to get into an interaction between characters is to make those characters talk to each other. It'll get you right in it. Right? Like, yes, you can have scenes where characters don't speak, and it's this beautiful interaction between these 2 characters that your reader can get super involved in. You know, Andy Weir is amazing at this, right? Like he's a great sci-fi author. Like his recent book, The Hail Mary Project, has some great scenes where the 2 characters in the spaceship are working out this problem, and you're watching them both work on it. Now, even those scenes where they're like doing math together, you're going to find they're like 60-70% dialogue, because it's that dialogue that pulls us into the moment and gets us in those woods, like actually feeling the environment of the scene. So if you can like think of your scenes when you look at the scene you're writing and you're like, okay, am I trying to look down at the world from 10,000 feet or am I in amongst the trees? If you're not in amongst the trees, figure out how to get down in amongst the trees. And the problem is that it makes our books a lot longer, because like we end up taking these books and making them like, you know, these big summary paragraphs a lot of times are going to end up being like 2 to 3 scenes. So like your book is going to end up being longer, but your reader's going to engage in it more, because the scene is so much more captivating to be in the forest than just looking down on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. You mentioned a few comments ago about cadence Can
Yeah.
you describe what that means in relation to dialogue?
Yeah, so we break that. That's kind of a that's kind of a dialogue doctor dialoguer. That's what we call our people on our community are dialoguers. It's kind of a dialogue word. So we break dialogue down into 4 things: words, body language, cadence, and pacing. The words are the topics and language that a character talks about. And this is goes, so you would ask me like the 2 mistakes writers make. The first mistake is that like summarizing and not getting me in the scene. The second mistake is all their characters sound the same. And so we use these 4 categories of like these 4 components of dialogue to help you diversify your character voices, to help you think about them in a little bit different way. Because a lot of times we think about voices as like, oh, this is this personality and this personality, but we don't actually think about how that personality is expressed through a character voice. We just like, oh, he's an Enneagram 6 and she's an Enneagram 3. And then we go to write them, and weirdly our Enneagram 6 and 3 sound exactly alike, right? Like, so we need to like figure out how to break down that like that personality into an actual voice. And then, because the reader doesn't experience your personality, they experience the voice that you write. So we break those voices down into words, by words, body language, cadence, and pacing. Words are the topics that the character chooses to talk about, and the words the character uses, like the actual like words you're putting on the page, the language the character's expressing. Do they talk in like professional terms, or do they talk in like, 2-penny words, or do they talk in like, $10 words? Like what words are they using to construct their thoughts? And then what topics are they choosing to talk about? So like a selfish character or a narcissistic character is going to talk about themselves all the time. Whereas like a shy character is going to choose topics that divert the conversation away from them. They're never going to talk about themselves because they don't want energy focused on them. So like, that's the first component. The second one is body language. And again, it maps a lot of personality. So like if you're a gregarious character, you're going to talk with your hands a lot. You're going to move around a lot. But if you're a guarded character who feels defensive all the time, you're going to cross your arms a lot. You're going to put your hands in your pockets, right? Like you're going to seal yourself off and have protective body language that's very tight and guards you in. If you're a character that engages with people a lot, you're going to be reaching out to touch people, right? Like you're going to be motioning towards people a lot, like these body gestures that like are intended to like connect us with one another. So body language is that second piece. And then the third piece is cadence. Cadence is the actual like sentence structure. So short sentences or long sentences? Do they speak in one sentence or multiple sentences? And when you start playing with that sentence structure and like the different punctuations they use, so for example, like a character that's very deliberative and that like is slow to speak is probably only going to give you one sentence per utterance, right? Now, if they're deliberative and highly intelligent, that one sentence is going to be well constructed and complex in its construction, right? If they're deliberative and uneducated, that sentence is probably going to be simple in structure, right? Subject, verb, object, period. So by like playing with the sentence structure, we can start to express that personality in another way. It's just another one of those tools that we have. Eric, were you going to jump in? I'm sorry, you got to like.
No.
Okay.
I'm just I'm with you.
Gotcha. I saw you raising your finger, so I was like, if you gotta give me that like cut it motion.
No.
Otherwise, I'll just go. So, and the fourth one is that pacing, and the way we talk about pacing is how they interact with the other characters in the conversation. So a character that, if you want somebody that feels like a charismatic leader, they're going to start the conversation. They're going to constantly try to control the topic of the conversation. So they're going to make topic sentences that like draw people in, but definitely like control where the conversation is headed. And then usually they're going to try to have the last word, right? But if you have a more like professorial character who is, more of a learner and sees like part of their personality is like, oh, I'm here to learn from everybody else all the time, I love learning, their pacing is going to be probably more waiting while other characters talk and then interjecting questions right here and there. If you've got the like real popular right now, I've seen a lot of people that I edit are the like goth characters, the like dark and brooding and angry and mad characters, and often they're like, well, I want them to be dark and brooding, but I also want them to have a sense of humor when they're with their friends. So what I tell them is like, okay, that's all about pacing.
Right.
So if you're dark and brooding, then that character is going to sit in silence while all the other characters talk, and then every once in a while they're going to try to slide in a biting one-liner. That one-liner is going to be one sentence. It's going to have a period to it or a question mark if the question mark is ironic, and that's what you're going to get from that character. So just know, and I was talking to some authors about this earlier this week, just know that like if you are writing a what we call a big cast scene, which is like 3 to 5 characters, if you're writing a big cast scene and you want one of the characters in that scene to be dark and brooding but comical, then you better have some characters in that scene that'll talk, because if they're all dark and brooding, this is going to be a really tough scene to write. And like when you start thinking about your character voices and how they break down and like this, you know, words, body language, cadence, and pacing, you can then start kind of mixing and matching them to be like, okay, what creates a great conflict in like a group cast, or, you know, how does a group cast complement each other? Like, how can I put, like, if I have all shy characters, this is going to be a very quiet book. Right. Like, so like, you know,
Right.
start thinking about like the tone you want of your cast, and then start thinking about like how you're mixing and matching those personalities, expressing them through a character voice. And that'll pull you away from that second big error that I see others making all the time, which is this monomouth. Like we think where all the characters sound the same. Like we think about plot all the time. We have huge charts and whiteboards and like scenes that we're supposed to have, but the plot is just the bones, right? Like the meat, the thing that makes your plot move, the thing that makes that like body of work go are the characters. And if you're not like spending time thinking about your character voices, then you've got this, you better hope your skeleton's really great, because otherwise like you're not actually going to make that plot move around it.
I have a question, and this comes from sitting through numerous writing classes, and it's always about tagging, right? So you'll see I've been in classes where I've heard an instructor say, tag every bit of dialogue that you have with only said. So there's that hard and fast rule. Then there's the other hard and fast rule that great dialogue just breathes, and if it's really flowing and the characters are well drawn, then you can go without tagging. So where do you come in on that sort of technical element on you know, does tagging dialogue slow it down? Is it repetitious? What do you feel?
I love that question so much.
You can tell I've gone to a lot of writers conferences and I've
it's
listened
such
to
a
a
great
lot of stuff and then internalize it all into neurosis.
Yeah, it's so great. And so I'm laughing because this question always gets me in so much trouble. I will get letters about this, like you said. So I understand the always you said crew, and I understand the never tag anything crew, and I disagree with all of them. So your dialogue tag, and to be clear, the simplest form of a dialogue, let's define a term. The simplest form of a dialogue tag is he said or she said or they said, right? Like it's that said. More complex tags are the like, you know, he picked up his coffee mug and took a sip expression, right? Like that, like then the utterance, like that is also a dialogue tag, right? Like using that body language is also a dialogue tag. So because you're indicating anything you're doing to indicate who's speaking counts under that like dialogue tag banner. So now that we know what dialogue tag is, it's this beautiful tool you can use to control the cadence of your character and to control the pacing of your conversation. And how you use that tool, one, is part of your own style, and two, varies based on how many characters are in the conversation. So the rules change based on how many people you have. So I break conversations down into 3 different types: one-on-ones, big cast, and chorus. One-on-ones are just 2 characters. When you've got 2 characters, dialogue tags are all about art form, right? The interchange between the characters is going to build energy. So the shorter those interchanges are, the faster it's going to feel, right? Like West Wing is famous for these walk and talks where like the characters are walking and talking and they're literally like speaking in half sentences over top of each other. And it creates all this great like conversational energy, right? Like you love it. That's why like one of the things that we love about the show. So that's one way to like, if you want to replicate that kind of feeling in your novel, then you need characters that speak in short cadences, and you need to keep all of the dialogue tags out, right? Because you just want utterance. If you want a more thoughtful character and you've got a one-on-one conversation, put that dialogue tag before they speak, right? And that will physically slow your reader down and make that character feel more thoughtful, make them feel more like they're thinking about something. If you want a character that feels like they're struggling to get their sentences together, like I am right now, put that dialogue tag in the middle of the sentence, right? Like, and make it part of their character voice. This is how they speak, right? They say a sentence, you give them a dialogue tag where they like fiddle with a pencil, and then they say something else. It creates like this feeling of like, oh, they're like coming up with this on the fly. So when you're in the one-on-one, dialogue tags are all about art and all about how you want to express that character voice. And you're free to use them however you want, right? If you're just doing he said, she said for every single utterance, you're wasting a tool. If you're removing them completely, just to remove them, you're wasting a tool, right? Like you have this great tool, use it to engage your reader's imagination and what you want that conversation to sound like in their mind. Before I talk about like big cast and chorus, how does that feel, Eric? Does that feel different than?
Well, I think that's how I've synthesized those two polar opposite, because we've all read great books that minimize dialogue tags, use them artfully. And so there is, as always, when there's two polar opinions, there's something in the middle is where you can strive.
So when you get to that big cast conversation, the rules change, because now your readers need to know who's speaking. And unless you're writing in dialect or you have really strong character voices, you have to indicate who they're speaking. So now using those dialogue tags becomes solely about character voice and how that dialogue tag impacts that character voice. So if you have a character that's quick on their feet and talks quickly, you always put that dialogue tag at the end, and it's always he said or she said, because, or Benny said, because you don't want that dialogue tag slowing down their cadence at all. Again, if you have a thoughtful character, you're putting that dialogue tag up front, right? Like to indicate who's talking. So when you get in that big cast scene, you have to use them. You cannot avoid them, because the worst thing you can do with dialogue is lose your reader. Like your words are this, line between your reader and your reader's imagination and the story you want to tell, right? Like they're that like tether between the two. And if you cut the tether and you lose the reader, picking them back up is really hard. So once you've got them, keep them. You got them in the book, keep them in the book. So, don't lose them because they can't tell who's talking. Right. And, Churchill said this about leadership, which is one of my favorite leadership quotes, but like the worst thing a leader can do is set up expectations and then not follow through with them. And the same is true of your scene. The worst thing you can do is get a reader thinking that these three characters are talking and then realize halfway through the scene that that's actually not who is talking. And now they have to go back and reread the scene or reimagine the scene. And like, it's already hard to get people to read. Asking them to read something twice is like, why would you do that? So in a big cast scene, always make it clear. A chorus scene is different. A chorus scene, we can really only hold as a reader, like really good readers can hold like 7 voices in their head in a scene. But most readers are holding like 3 to 5 voices in their head in the scene. If you get more than 5 voices, you need to start grouping them into what the Greeks call a chorus in their dramas, which is characters that spoke and acted in unison. So there's a fantastic short story, All Summers in a Day. That's a sci-fi short story that does this. There's 2, it's about an elementary school class on Venus. There's 2 characters that speak to each other, a little girl and a little boy. speak, and then there's the rest of the class, and the rest of the class is called the children. And so they move and act as a mob. I referenced that one because it's 2,000 words, super easy to read. The name of the author is totally slipping my mind, but he's a sci-fi legend, and it's going to drive me crazy that I can't remember it. But it's free online, so you can just go look at it. It's a classic chorus scene. In that one, with the main characters that are talking, you get to revert to the one-on-one, and then the chorus you have to always refer to when they jump in, because they're going to jump into the conversation a lot less, right? Like it's the one-on-one plus a chorus. And so, and the chorus isn't going to speak as much. They're kind of commenting on what's happening between the one-on-one. So that has like, you get to go back once you get over a certain number of characters, you got to group them together, but it allows you to go back to your artful one-on-one where dialogue tags can be more kind of like free flowing. Yeah, and I think it's important to know what kind of scene you're writing. That's one of the things I tell, like when we workshop scenes and with the dialoguers, it's one of those things of like, how many characters are here, right? Like know that before you start writing this scene. How many people are going to be in this scene? Because it's going to change how you're writing this dialogue. So like, because also in a big cast scene, one of the big things that people struggle with around dialogue tags is they lose characters in the conversation. So like if you get more than 2 people, a lot of times you'll have 3 people on the scene and they start off all 3 of them talking, and then as the writer you get really engaged in 2 of them, and so you kind of forget that the 3 characters there, and then you like bring them back. But you can't do that because we want to cinematically imagine the scene. And the one thing movies and TV have over us is that their characters that aren't saying things get included in the scene because they're visually present. Right. So we have to constantly be letting the reader know what the characters that aren't like in the spotlight, but are in the scene are doing, so that we know where they are. We know what's happening with them, right? Like, even if it's just like a nod or like they sighed, or we need to know how they're emotionally responding to the conversation that's going on. So it's super important in those like big cast scenes not to lose those characters and make sure that you're balancing them throughout the conversation, so that the reader can imagine the scene with you. If that makes sense.
So I think a lot of writers, myself included, in the not so distant past, thought that dialogue with a capital D was only words in quotation marks. And in the course of this conversation, you've made us see that it's really the relationships, the dialogue includes the characters' relationships and how they react to each other in the scene. So
yeah, I would define it as the emotional exchange between characters.
Okay. So I've heard you speak before on the vehicle, and I would love, before we wrap up, for you to bring that up, because I think that really embodies character archetypes in a way that I have never heard anybody else use, and it's super interesting.
Okay. It's really funny. Yeah. So we found this problem in the community when I was working with writers, to kind of talk about the role characters play in the book. So I'd be talking to a writer and they'd be like, well, this is my hero and this is my villain and this is my ally, and this character is kind of a side character. And then as we were talking about it, they're like, well, but my hero's not really good and doesn't really make good decisions, and my ally's a friend of my hero, but is actually like, when it comes to the emotional journey of my point of view character, the ally is actually like pushing back on them and like tearing them apart. And this is technically the villain of the story, but it's also the one that I want my reader to relate to. Like, and it's a fun voice, like, especially when you start divining character voices, you find that like the characters that you thought were side characters, like, okay, it was a side character, but I really like him. So I want to write him more. So we just found that like those terms weren't helpful in talking about character arc and character transformation, because the goal of a dialogue centric scene is to take your reader on an emotional journey. So if dialogue is, in its philosophical concept, the emotional exchange between two characters, what you're seeing is an emotional journey that your reader is going on. Scenes are small emotional journeys. Your book is the culmination of the emotional journeys of your scenes. You're taking this reader on this path. Vonnegut talked about this in an amazing way. He'd just draw a graph and he'd be like, hey, there's different types of stories. There's Man in the Well, starts happy, gets really sad, gets really happy again. Man in the Well. Like there's Cinderella, right? Like starts great, everything goes to crap, and then suddenly it's magical, right? Like, and he goes through like the 9 different types of stories. And what he's talking about when he's drawing those graphs, if anybody's, you can find the talk on YouTube, if anybody's watching those talks, is he's talking about the emotional journey that your reader's going on in your story, right? Like tragedy, they start feeling okay, and then, oh crap, everything's going to, it's a dumpster fire, right? Like, so it's just this kind of like, that's how we need to think about our scenes and think about our books. And so hero, villain, ally, all of that doesn't, side characters doesn't help. So we came up with new language. We always tell writers, find a vehicle. So the vehicle is the character or characters, sometimes you have more than one, that your reader is going to go on the emotional journey with, right? They're riding in the vehicle. So Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series, Percy's the vehicle, right? We're riding with Percy through this emotional journey. Harry Potter series, Harry's the vehicle, right? In a more complex work that bends more literary, like Beloved by Toni Morrison, right? Like we've got Sethi, Paul D as the 2 vehicles, right? Like we're riding, and your vehicle when it's a point of view character, right? That's the character that your reader is centering in on, is that point of view character. So think about that character as what that character experiences, the emotions that character has are the emotions that your reader is going to experience. So if you're charting out the emotional like tone of a scene or the emotional flow of a book, you're really talking about like, what is the emotional journey of my vehicle characters or my vehicle character? Alongside the vehicle characters, we have engines and anchors. So your vehicle character, the minute they start the emotional journey, your reader has a dream. Ideally, you've hinted to it a little bit of like, this is the best possible transformation for this character. This is the best outcome. This is who I want this character to become at the end of the book, right? So Bridget Jones' Diary. Bridget starts off with my life is a mess and I want to become something else. And we immediately get a vision of like what she could possibly become. And they bring alongside her in the movie, I can't remember the character's name. I think his name is Darcy. Surely not. They bring alongside a character who's played by Colin Firth in the movie, who's like, when she's around him, she's the best version of herself. Now they are antagonistic with each other, right? Like they're always fighting, but when she's around him, she says exactly what she wants to say. She's confident, she's put together, she's not self-conscious in any way. He's her engine, right? Like whenever he comes around, whenever that character comes around, they propel the character to be the best version of themselves. Sometimes engines are villains, right? Like in every Batman comic book or movie you've ever seen, it's always the villain that helps Batman become Batman. He's Batman because of this villain pushed him. That villain is operating as an engine in the story. When that villain comes around, he's going to challenge Batman to be the best version of himself. Sometimes, like in the Harry Potter saga that we mentioned, the engines are allies. So Ron and Hermione are the ones that pull Harry to constantly be the best version of themselves. So they take that character arc on that upswing where we're matching our imagination to this is the best possible outcome of that character. The other side of that are the anchors. And we call them anchors because if you see your car kind of driving along a graph where it's like best and worst, the anchors are going to pull them down to the worst version of themselves. So Romeo and Juliet, all of Romeo's friends, all anchors, they're always driving to be the worst version of himself. Even when his best friend is dying, he's like cursing both families. He's talking about how Romeo's the worst, right? Like pulling Romeo down into this worst version of himself. And that's what anchors do. So going back to the Bridget Jones example, in that movie, you've got
Hugh Grant.
Thank you, Hugh Grant, Notting Hill guy. You've got Hugh Grant. When he comes around, even though he's a romantic interest, and we would probably call him, not necessarily a protagonist, but he's kind of an ally at times in that story. And he's one of the love triangles, like he's one of the main characters, but he's totally an anchor. When he comes around, Bridget is the worst version of herself. Right? She's self-conscious. She's stuttering. She's worried about how she's looking all the time. She's making terrible decisions about how much she drinks and how much sex she has, right? Like she's doing all the things that she says at the beginning of the book. I don't want to be this person anymore. He comes around and he drags her down. And then we start to get the tension in our cast between like what is going to happen with our characters. We get the anchors pulling down, we get the engines pulling up, and we're on this emotional road with our characters. So when the engines come around, characters' best version of themselves, whether that engine is a villain or an ally. When the anchors come around, whether that character is a villain or an ally, when the anchors come around, characters the worst version of themselves. And you start to feel the tension between the two. In a tragedy, the anchors are going to win. In a heroic story, the engines are going to win, right? Like Harry Potter in the end, the engines win because Ron, Hermione, and Dumbledore are kind of like pulling Harry to be the best version of himself. And Voldemort and, the Slytherin house doesn't pull him into being the worst version of himself, right? Like, so it's that kind of transition between what the character is going to be. And then we talk about side characters as hazards. Because what we say is when you're going to put a character in a scene and your vehicle is just going to be in that scene with that character 1 or 2 times, go big with that voice to force your character to make some decisions, right? So the book I referenced earlier, Sean's book, S.W. Miller's book, is great. He had this scene with a taxi cab driver. It's after this action scene, his lead character, his vehicle character is in this taxi, and his vehicle character is having this kind of like painful, heartfelt conversation with his friend. And there's this taxi cab driver in the front scene, and Sean keeps having the taxi cab driver like interrupt in the scene, but he's not really doing anything. He's just kind of like moving the prose along. And so it's like, no, make that voice big. Make them big, either obnoxious big or pleasant big or fun big, but go bigger with that voice in a way that's going to force your vehicle character to swerve emotionally, to create more movement in the scene. So Sean made the taxi cab driver this super talkative taxi cab driver, which created more conflict in the scene because his 2 main characters are trying to have a difficult conversation. And now you've got this kind of like fun and games taxi cab driver who is constantly interrupting and inserting herself into the conversation. And it made the whole scene just flow, right? Like it just moves at this really dynamic pace because you've increased the conflict by taking this hazard voice and throwing it in front of your vehicle and making your vehicle swerve one way or the other. So that's how we started using those terms, vehicle, engine, and anchor or hazard, as we like plan out our plots and think about the scenes we're telling. If you're pantsing and you're not plotting and you're like, man, I really need, like, I know that I need to, like, my character needs to be challenged here. If you know what characters are your anchors, you can just go like, I'm going to throw my vehicle into a conversation with an anchor. And suddenly your character is going to be questioning who they are by the end of the scene, right? Like, but so thinking about characters in a way that like pushes you to consider how your characters transform, how your point of view characters transforming in these conversations can really help empower your scenes.
That's amazing.
Love it.
Yeah, I'm glad. Sorry, I just spewed out like 1,000 words. In 2 minutes. Yeah, here it comes.
A good draft, though. It was a really good draft. 1,000 words.
It was dialogue centric.
Dialogue centric, 1,000 words. Jeff just talks. In Jeff's character voice, his cadence is 1,000 sentences, all with commas, no periods, because they just run and run and run.
He said at the end.
He said, as to get that dialogue tag out of the way.
Oh, well, I feel like we've taken up a whole bunch of your time, and you're also on a completely different coast with a different time zone, and it's later than we are. So I appreciate your time, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, this was fun.
Eric, is there anything else you want to ask? Jeff, is there anything you want to like say that you haven't said yet? You talked about
I think I said all of the things.
So yeah, well, let's plug your workshop again, February 26th.
Yeah, February 26th. And just come to, if you want to start like working on your dialogue, working on craft, dialoguedoctor.com. We send out a newsletter every Tuesday morning. That's a free, like, hey, here's something to think about in your dialogue. It's very craft focused. When you sign up for the newsletter, you get a free kind of real short idea book that's like, here's 7 mistakes you can correct in your dialogue right now. So newsletter comes out every Tuesday, podcast comes out every Monday. Like I said on the podcast, every other episode I'm editing with an author, or my partner Laura's editing with an author. And then on the off ones, we're usually doing interviews and conversations with editors, or we're answering questions from the community. And then we've got the Dialoguer community going on. Come and be a part of that. And then we do big workshops. We do 4 of them a year. And so the 26th is our first one this year. And it's a new one for us. We've never done this one before. So it's going to be fun.
Exciting. Yeah.
Cool.
Fun one to be a part of.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, and yeah, we'll see you all next time.
And all the things. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic.
All right. Bye now.
Bye, y'all.